Good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome to our AWARE webinar today on attachment styles and relationships. We're just going to take a moment or two to allow people to join before we get started. So settle in and we'll start shortly. So welcome to those joining. My name is Dr. Susan Brannick. I'm Clinical Director here at AWARE. For those of you who aren't familiar with AWARE, we provide free support services and wellbeing programs for anyone affected by anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorder, including those supporting loved ones. So we have a lot of mental health resources available on our website, aware.ie. So do have a look at that if you want more information. And today, as I said, we're going to talk about attachment styles and relationships and mental health. So I'm really delighted to be joined by Dr. Muireann McNulty and Dr. Eimear Farrell. So just to introduce our two guests today, Dr. Muireann McNulty is a principal clinical psychologist and psychology manager at the Clúnmhaire service in Dublin. Excuse me, a chartered clinical psychologist with the PSI and the BPS, an accredited psychotherapist, an advanced certified schema therapist, supervisor and trainer with the International Society for Schema Therapy. So Muireann has worked in public adult mental health services since 1997, including supervising psychologists from UCD and UL and TCD. She was an assistant professor and lecturer in clinical psychology in UCD from 2015 to 2017 and continues to teach and train clinical trainees and supervisors about schema therapy. So Muireann returned to full-time work at Clúnmhaire in December 2022 to take up the principal manager post. So you're very, very welcome, Muireann. And to introduce Dr. Eimear Farrell. Eimear is a senior clinical psychologist and an advanced accredited schema therapist and supervisor, trainer, an integrated humanistic psychotherapist with over 20 years experience working in mental health. She's currently setting up a psychology service for people who are attending the HSE Chronic Disease Management Program in the Midwest. Eimear has a particular interest in schema therapy and provides supervision and training to psychologists and psychotherapists interested in developing their skills in this area. Eimear previously was involved in the doctoral program in clinical psychology at UCD for a number of years and continues to contribute to the doctoral program in UL, where she delivers training in schema therapy. You're very welcome, Eimear. Welcome to both of you. A bit of a mouthful there, a lot of experience and expertise. So delighted really to have this conversation with you both today. And as I said, we're talking about attachment, how early relationships affect us throughout our lives and impact on our mental health. So I suppose for many of you watching, you might be very familiar with attachment. It's originally attributed to the work of a psychoanalyst, John Bowlby, and psychologist Mary Ainsworth in the latter part of the last century. So attachment theory really is the idea that as humans, we need to develop connections with key caregivers from birth for security and safety, both physical and emotional. And these attachments are in the service of protecting us from danger, really. And I suppose the theory of attachment explores what happens when these connections are threatened or jeopardized. So in our webinar today, we're going to explore how these early attachment experiences affect us both as children as well as into adulthood. So we looked at the impact of attachment on mental health and really maybe delve into the emotions, the beliefs, the behaviors that relate to our attachment experiences as adults as well as kind of children. So we look at that detail of how it plays out in a way maybe kind of, I suppose, gets into more detail beyond the labels of secure and insecure attachment styles. So we really kind of drill down into what that actually means. So as I said, welcome to both of you again. And I might start with you, Muireann. Maybe if you might be able to start with kind of telling us a bit more about, I suppose, how early relationships influence and form us.
Yeah, what we experience with our parents, our caregivers, it's formative of our sense of ourselves, of our sense of relationships, and of how we predict the future. And children are born in a very vulnerable and dependent state. You could even think of the first 3 years or 3 months of life as the sort of the fourth trimester. The baby needs to be born so their head can fit through the birth canal, but they've huge physical needs for care and nurturance from their caregiver. And to ensure they get that care that they need to survive, they come into the world ready to attach to the caregiver. The baby is primed to form a connection with a caring other, to pay attention to touch, to pay attention to the human voice, especially the mother's voice, and to human faces. And that wonderful parental bias where the parent feels that their child is especially wonderful, it exists so that all going well, the parent will willingly give the infant the care and nurturance that the child needs to thrive. And children are sponges. They're learning huge amounts on a daily basis in their homes, picking up the rules and the regularities, figuring out how things work, how people work. And lots of what we experience in our particular home with our specific parents is generally true about the world. So for example, if we drop something at home, it falls down because of gravity. But gravity also applies outside our homes. It's a general rule. Similarly, if we smile at someone in our home, they'll usually smile back. And this also usually works outside our home. So vast amount of what we learn to be true in our homes is also true beyond our homes. But every family is a little bit different, and every parent has their own unique strengths and difficulties. And in ways in which a caregiver is different or reacts differently to others outside the home, the child is learning something that's true in their home, but that might not be generally true. So for example, a stressed and maybe unsupported parent or a parent with an addiction problem might be very quick to strong anger. They might go from a little bit annoyed to explosive in a heartbeat. And a child might reasonably start to expect that all adults or all people in authority or any person who's a little bit annoyed or a little bit bothered might be similarly impatient or volatile or needing to be carefully managed.
That's really interesting, isn't it? So I guess that idea that what happens in the home you sort of expect to be replicated, that's your sort of template.
Yes,
yes. And I guess, as you say, kind of as we become adults, we kind of might have different experiences, but when you have a very limited range of experience, that's what you think is going to happen across all adults. Yeah. And it's interesting, maybe you're touching in there kind of on the emotional needs of children. I wonder, is there much research on that and how these can be met and the impact of that?
Yeah, for sure. And that one of the most important research finding is that in addition to children having physical needs, the physical needs we expect, like need for food, water, shelter, the children also have a set of emotional needs, and these include a need for love and nurturance, for safety, protection, for autonomy, to feel confident, to express their feelings and needs, for some realistic limits, and for spontaneity and play. So when a parent is not at their best and maybe not able to meet the child's emotional needs, the child's mind is making sense of this, and usually or often comes to the idea that the problem is their fault, that they may be too much of something. Oh, I'm too slow, I'm too hyper, I'm too messy, I'm too lazy, I'm too stupid. Or maybe I'm too little of something. I'm not pretty enough, I'm not clever enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable enough. And at some deep level as children, we start to believe the problem is in us. This filter or belief about ourselves as defective or unlovable or unworthy or unsafe, that can become really bedded in and become part of how we see ourselves. And similarly, beliefs about other people get formed in childhood, that others are not caring, that they're not trustworthy, that they won't be there for us, that they'll try to hurt us or harm us. Those also bed in and become like a filter that we bring forward with us into our adult lives.
It's almost like the glasses you're looking at, or you're looking through to see the world, isn't it? It's interesting, as you said there, that idea around that kind of need for love and nurturance and safety. And I guess there's a lot of people maybe listening to this that sounds really obvious to, and maybe, but also it's a culturally evolving idea, isn't it? So, 50, 60, 100 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case, that was so clear, So it's interesting how the research evolves, that there's those kind of basic needs that are also emotional. And I guess that idea too, and we'll probably, maybe that's the crux really of what we're talking about it today, that internalizing of the problem is probably in me. That's if I'm doing X or Y, that's why this is happening. As kids, we have that way of navigating the world, don't we? And I suppose it might have a bit of an adaptive function. So to preserve that relationship maybe with the parent or the caregiver, the problem is taken in as the child. It kind of might give the appearance maybe of being able to control it then or change it. So like maybe feeling anxious and afraid, that's a problem in the child. So if they never complain or get upset, then no one's going to get cross with them. So it becomes something that they can manage themselves. And maybe that's a way then that can be taken into adulthood, isn't it? So I guess they're really key ideas, and obviously they change over time, but they're kind of, as you say, bed in is quite a good way to describe it. It can do from the beginning. And maybe Eimear, coming to you and kind of back to the parent or caregiver, do we know much about whether ways of kind of connecting and meeting children's emotional needs can can be supported or learned? Like, can you learn this if you don't feel so kind of adept at it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's really important to have that message of hope and know that our brains continue to evolve throughout our lives. So things that we learned from our early relationships can change. And I suppose two of the key ways that can happen is firstly by developing healthy relationships later on. So maybe we meet colleagues or friends or life partners that really are supportive, or a mentor at work that are encouraging and allow us to have some of those early needs for nurturing and care and consideration met. And then we can realize actually it doesn't have to be like this. And I suppose the other second part of that is having that capacity to reflect. So being able to reflect on our past and learn to make sense of it. So be able to think about in what way our parents did meet our needs. Maybe there was always food on the table, or there was always a consistent present there, but maybe our parents weren't so good at allowing us to express our emotions, or maybe giving us age appropriate freedom, and really understanding, I guess, how the past can get reflected in the present, in how certain things trigger us or annoy us in our relationships with others and with our children, and beginning to understand and become aware of that, so then we can have a choice about how we respond once we have a better understanding of what's going on for us.
Yeah, yeah, that's really important, isn't it? And we might kind of return to that a bit later on. I guess it's that key bit of self-awareness, isn't it? To say that the past is always in the present in certain respects, and kind of knowing what might be activating or distressing, and where that might kind of come from. But it's an important message too, that isn't it, that things do evolve and change. Things don't have to be the same, and different relationships will offer something maybe potentially different. And and I guess, Muireann, it makes me think a little bit about the webinar from last time as well, around childhood trauma and adverse childhood experiences. Do you think, is there a bit of a connection there in terms of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, for sure. And the research on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs as they're sometimes called, it's very relevant here. And I think over the last 20 years in Ireland, we've a much greater awareness of the long shadow of the cast by abuse in childhood. For example, the abuse that children experiencing in industrial schools and institutions. And we've much better understanding as a community that just because the person has reached adulthood and that abuse may no longer be happening in the here and now, that a person might still be very much affected by past abuse in how they feel about themselves and how they're relating to other people. And in the therapy room, we often meet people who, to speak about physical and sexual abuse, and often nowadays they're more spontaneously connecting this to some adult difficulties they're experiencing, for example, in a relationship, or with self-esteem, or with depression. And in other words, they're showing themselves some understanding and compassion, because they understand that some dreadful wrongs were committed against them, and that bad things happen to them that have created emotional wounds. So people are more ready to start the work of healing those wounds, and maybe offering themselves more compassion around what happened to them.
Yeah, it's a hard one, isn't it? And I guess that kind of culturally we're kind of understanding that more, as you say, that kind of just because it's not happening now doesn't mean the implications and the consequences aren't being lived now. And sometimes it can be kind of tricky to make those links. So it's interesting, as you say, and certainly I would see that too, in the kind of that link between what's happened before to a person and how it shows up in current life. And maybe there's kind of less obvious ideas or rules that we might pick up as children as well, about how we should feel or what we should do in response to certain things. Like, maybe you touched on this already, maybe a little bit, Eimear, but like, kind of rules about whether it's okay to be angry or upset or annoyed. And I wonder what you think about whether that ties in with, I guess, our freedom maybe to express emotions, and how that works out for people.
Yeah, and as Muireann highlighted, when we're talking about those core emotional needs, that being able to express our feelings freely and be met in a safe and contained way by a parent or other who's going to help us manage our feelings is so important. And I suppose even if we think of us as adults, when we're having a bad day or something happens and we feel really angry about it, often having a friend or a partner or colleague to to be able to express that with is so important to help us to regulate our emotions and have our nervous system come back into sync. And I suppose, like Muireann was highlighting there, historically, I suppose there's been a lot of culturally in Ireland, a lot of things that weren't dealt with very well, and that has, as Maureen said, long shadows. So, for example, even in terms of culturally talking honestly and openly about our emotions doesn't come as naturally, I think, to us as Irish people as maybe it does in some other cultures. So that can be tricky. And if we've had an early experience where, for example, anger wasn't allowed. You weren't allowed to be angry. We don't learn healthy ways to express anger or know what the function of anger is, which of course is to help us to stand up for ourselves. If we grew up in a home where sadness wasn't dealt with well, whether it was either dismissed, like you shouldn't be feeling like that, or that's not okay, or you should be over it by now, or maybe we're distracted and not having the opportunity to have someone sit with us and soothe us, that when our children or our loved ones or people in a relationship express those feelings, we can have a strong reaction and maybe not respond in a way that we would like to, but we just can't figure out why is this that when someone gets angry or sad, I find it really difficult. It really sets me off. So I think that's important. And I also think intergenerationally, our parenting norms are certainly changing, but historically, maybe, you would hear people say, or I certainly would in therapy room, things like, children should be seen and not heard, which is again saying that children shouldn't be allowed to express themselves. And I suppose, sometimes older people kind of say, but that means, you're kind of spoiling them, or, this idea that you can spoil the child. But I think it's, like Muireann mentioned, the importance of limit setting, so that they go hand in hand. So it's not that we just allow our children to express their feelings and not teach them different ways or better ways to express their feelings. I think that's probably important to mention too, that limit setting is also important.
It's like a kind of say a boundary, but maybe it's a container around it, isn't it? So it's how you might connect with that emotion and limit setting with that too. It's interesting, isn't it? And I suppose that ties into the self-compassion piece, that maybe if you've never had an experience of someone soothing you when you felt sad or scared, it's very difficult then to know what to do when you have that emotion. And that's so, and I guess we can get tied up in knots of it. I should be able to do this, or I should not feel this way. But I guess if you've never had that modeled maybe in a way that wasn't so helpful at the time, it can be difficult. So it's about learning it. And as you say, similarly, when other people might express or experience an emotion that you find very difficult, and maybe sometimes it's difficult to recognize emotions, isn't it? It's hard to tell if someone is angry or if you're angry. So there's a lot of, I think it's quite helpful. I think there's a lot of things that you can learn in that, it's not about, as you say, kind of being defined by your past, but it's understanding it enough that you can make sense of what's happened, and maybe, as I think one of you mentioned, make different choices then in how you respond. And maybe it makes me think too, we're kind of going back to what you were saying about the ACEs, and I suppose we're kind of talking about a bit of continuum, aren't we? And as a society, we've got much better at identifying the kind of major kind of traumas or kind of adverse childhood events, but maybe there's also kind of more hidden or less understood traumatic experiences that can affect people.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about that.
The other kind of adversity in childhood is when good things that all children need, like love and positive attention and being valued, being deeply cared about, when they don't happen or don't happen reliably or often enough. Yeah, and some people regularly, sadly, experience that absence of love and care when they're little, or they're regularly humiliated or relentlessly criticized, ignored, or rejected. And much as it might be hard to think about, there are children who rarely experience love or being treasured, being important, mattering to their caregiver. And like being loved and valued is not just like an optional extra icing on the cake, but it's really a fundamental need of children. It really promotes children thriving. Bruce Perry is a psychiatrist and author with Oprah Winfrey of this really lovely book called What Happened to You, and it describes the research on the impact of children of bad things happening, like physical abuse and sexual abuse, and the impact on children of the absence of good things happening, like love and positive attention, and what we might call sort of emotional deprivation and neglect. And they highlight the enormous impact of the lack of consistent and predictable love. And that was similarly echoed in the UCD My World study in the 2000s with Barbara Dooley. They noted the importance of having one good adult, of the positive and protective impact of having someone who sees you and reflects back to you as a child and a young person your worth. Lee McCullough was a psychologist and researcher of psychotherapy, and she wrote about routinely asking clients in an early session about when they were young and saying, you know, whose eyes lit up when you came into a room. And that we all, as children, we need that the treasuring of at least one person. Yeah,
it's such an important idea, isn't it? And I guess there's, again, not to kind of keep going back to cultural ideas, but this idea, I think maybe Eimear, you touched on it, it's not spoiling a child to show that that love and affection, or to really, you know, get into the connection around a difficult emotion. It's this idea of being seen and not heard. And but actually, as you say, Muireann, it's just as important as the food and shelter and all the rest of it. Like it's a core need, and really having, I think it's an important study as well, that one good adult. So there is at least one person that can provide that, and how helpful that is.
One of my friends was telling me about sitting in a health center with her newborn baby, and with all the other mothers and their babies waiting for their babies to be weighed, and she was holding her little son, and she was just feeling overcome with like how lucky she was that she had the most beautiful baby in the room, and just feeling sort of mildly sorry for the other mums, with, you know, and it was just a lovely example of that healthy, positive parental bias, that you feel lucky with your child. And that your child is not inherently special to the whole world, but they're special to you, and it's that piece.
Yeah, it's nice, isn't it? I guess it's also an evolution sort of thing, isn't it? It keeps everyone protected and safe. So it's kind of in our design maybe to offer that. But obviously things can interact with that and make it challenging, but it's the core piece that's there. Do you think there's other ways maybe that early relationships affect us as adults?
Yeah, I mean, one of the real ironies is that, you know, that if we were treated really harshly, or we were really neglected as a child, so how we were treated often becomes our template for how we treat ourselves. So if we experience relentless criticism on a regular basis, or a really harsh, dismissive attitude, or someone being constantly irritated with us, then that way of treating becomes kind of our standard operating procedure as an adult. It's just what we offer ourselves. So for example, if we spill milk as an adult, instead of offering yourself a gentle and fair, oh look, accidents happen, we all spill milk, it's just milk. Our automatic reaction might just be a very exasperated, kind of judgy, oh, I'm such an idiot, I'm such a klutz, I can't do anything right, like, oh, what's wrong with me, here I go again. And you know, so if we rarely hear the child, it's just a little milk, accident happened, we all spill milk, it's easily mopped up, it's not a big deal. It can be so difficult then as an adult to offer yourself that kind of compassion, that sort of warm, accepting response. Being punished or scolded harshly can lead kind of to this perpetuating cycle of self-punishment or self-attack. Yeah,
it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And I guess it's often a question I might ask of people is, whose voice does that remind you of, or whose voice is that? You know, like that very like critical, harsh internal voice as an adult. So I guess, as we're saying, maybe like attachment really affects not just our relationships with other people and their relationships with us, but also our relationship with ourselves.
Right.
And that's, as you say, from spilling milk to a bereavement. It's going to be, it's how we respond is key, as opposed to the thing that's happened, isn't it?
So you can go all the way to New Zealand, you know, and get away from the people that maybe hurt you, or, you know, where the places where you had those emotional wounds, but in a way you're bringing people with you in your own head, and sort of recreating it on a daily basis by how you speak to yourself. Yeah,
it's fascinating, isn't it? And I guess so recreating it in your own head, and also maybe what other people in your current life represent to you. So it's kind of bringing that history, isn't it? So when you might respond in a certain way, it may not be to your partner, it might be to your memory of a caregiver, in a sense. That's maybe a bit basic, maybe as a way to describe it. obviously more complicated than that, but I suppose it's who the person might represent or what the relationship represents. I guess at the same time, though, some people might say, well, maybe kids don't remember, you know, they're probably quite resilient to some of those experiences. What would you say to that, Muireann?
I mean, I think, yes, children are wonderfully adaptive, and usually they use that to figure out how to try and get their emotional needs met. So to get love and attention, to try to keep themselves safe. You know, for some children, maybe they're working to avoid abandonment or criticism or humiliation. And this can lead, so for sometimes people, the child adapts by figuring out, okay, if I appease other people, if I please other people, if I try to stay safe under the radar, keep very small, be very undemanding of other people, that will keep me safe. And for some people, that can then become like a lifetime habit or a sort of a pattern of neglecting their own needs and prioritizing the needs of other people. So becoming maybe a people pleaser, being very all about you, all about the other person in relationships.
I guess that comes with a level of anxiety, doesn't it, about then not being able to do that and what might happen if it doesn't happen, which might bring us into that kind of anxious attachment style. So I suppose well, I guess what we're really describing is what actually happens under those labels, isn't it? This is the kind of mechanics of the dynamics between you and the other person beyond that kind of insecure or securely attached.
Yeah.
Do you think there's other survival kind of strategies that as kids we develop?
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, if a child is living, say, under constant threat and danger, it'd be very understandable to become very maybe cautious or wary about others, maybe reluctant to get into close relationships, maybe having a lifetime tendencies towards being very guarded or isolated from other people, maybe being very vigilant, hypervigilant to threat, pulling away from intimacy, and particularly in the face of conflict. For other children, it can start to feel like my upset feelings, which actually are a very normal response to chaos and conflict in your home, but maybe starting to feel like those feelings themselves are the problem, that if I could just not feel upset or angry or lonely, then it somehow would be easier. And to some extent, we all have an ability to kind of numb ourselves. So for example, if you're going for some really painful root canal, you can sort of try and, you know, switch off a little bit, sort of numb it out and try to be there, but not be there. And some children get really good at dialing down and switching off feelings in this very self-protective way. And this also can become a lifelong pattern. So in a childhood, that can protect you from when things are really painful. But a downside might be that if we aren't feeling much, it can be very hard for other people to kind of maybe get close to us. Or equally that it can be hard to feel like if we shut off emotion, you generally shut off all emotions. So then you're not really feeling joy and excitement. You can feel very meh or very numbed out. For other people, sometimes it might seem like the best form of defense from attack from the outside might be to put up a very high wall, to keep others out, or even to attack others before they attack us, or to be maybe a little bit prickly or overprotective. Maybe digging in and standing your ground might seem like the only path to safety. And so in all these examples of our strategies for survival, they do solve a problem for the child, but they also cost us something. And usually they keep us apart from others or make relationships distant or a little bit maybe one-dimensional. And this can further loneliness and isolation, which is usually not what we want. So it can be useful to track back a little to when we started using that survival strategy, to understand why we needed it then, and to look at, you know, how it benefited us then, and maybe how it's benefiting us now a little. And then to start to weigh up that with the cost, what it's costing us now. And to start to come to a decision about whether this strategy is still serving us or whether it's something we might want to start relying on a little bit less.
Yeah. And I guess it's kind of building awareness of that, isn't it? Because people may not have that awareness that that's their response in certain situations. Sometimes partners or friends are better maybe placed at times to say, well, this is what happens when we row, you know, you do X or Y. So maybe first is sort of understanding it a bit. And as you say, maybe then being able to weigh up the kind of costs potentially where it's a strategy maybe that's outlived its usefulness. then I guess the work of trying to do something different when we know we want to go one way, but we kind of end up kind of doing the old way. And that's, we'll kind of, maybe we'll come back to that in terms of what therapy can look like for people. But I guess it's maybe naming that is a process, you know, and self-compassion is really key in terms of getting your head around that and understanding where patterns of responding maybe have come from. And I guess as we're saying, maybe that is the attachment theory that's kind of elaborated on what you're saying. We're in of kind of maybe, you know, kind of attachment styles, whether that's anxious or anxious avoidant, or it's, as you say, kind of different ways of navigating the world to protect us from harm is essentially what it is, isn't it? So
it's highly anxiety provoking to sort of give up your survival strategy. It's you know, you're going to, at a very foundational level, you're going to feel really unsafe if you do, as you say, if you go the other direction.
Yeah, so I guess it's important to have a security net of some sort, isn't it, before you start making so there's an alternative as well to kind of be able to kind of have a second option maybe, or kind of a safety kind of in that respect. And I suppose maybe thinking that if someone did want to understand that more, make changes, what could help with that? Wherein do you think, or is that where we're thinking maybe therapy might come in?
Yeah. I mean, just like when we're children, we don't necessarily know that our you know, our normal emotional needs aren't being met, or that we're maybe interacting regularly with someone who really can't meet our needs or won't meet our needs. But later in life, as your world expands, then you meet more people outside your home or outside your immediate family, and you start to realize maybe that some of what you learned at home isn't universally true, and that certain ways of responding or reacting or being seen by others that we're used to or expect aren't actually generally true. And then people often get into, they sort of know that at a head level, that maybe I wasn't a difficult child, or maybe I wasn't a bad child or a lazy child, but maybe there was a parent who had a very short fuse, or a parent who struggled to regulate their own emotion, and that maybe kind of going back to ourselves as children and thinking, gosh, I was left a bit emotionally high and dry at times. But as adults, we can find ourselves in a bit of a kind of a head-heart split. So, you know, at a head level, I'm not bad, or I wasn't to blame as a child for much of what happened to me. That maybe certain key adults let me down at certain moments. But at the same time, sort of feeling in our hearts and even in our kind of in our body, in our bones, because we feel it, that we are to blame and that we are bad, or that we were always bad. And so to resolve that kind of heart split, to allow that new knowledge in about ourselves, it's for that to become really solid within us. We really need to be in relationships, and Eimear was saying it earlier, where our emotional needs are regularly met, and where we have a more kind and fair version of ourselves reflected back to us, and where people are kind of regular and consistent and predictable and warmly responsive in those ways. And some people are lucky enough to find that maybe through new friendships, through new love relationships, through gratifying workplaces, or you know, in good workplaces. Or for some people, you know, sometimes relationships with family members does improve because maybe some of the external stresses that were pushing on the family when you were growing up, those have resolved. Or sometimes, you know, caregivers do their own changing and growing, you know, do their own work. And sometimes then people do look to do some of that work with a therapist, as you know, as part of that healing journey.
Yeah, and I guess not necessarily strictly only a therapist. I guess it makes me think of what Judith Herman, you know, in her book about trauma and recovery, says that actually the healing does happen in relationships. Obviously, there's work, excuse me, that people need to do on their own, but I guess the real healing does happen in those connections with other people. And kind of
is,
sorry,
help is where you find it, you know, doesn't always have to be professional help by any means.
Exactly, and I guess it's interesting, that heart lag, isn't it? It's so true. It's kind of knowing it intellectually but not really believing it, as you say. And you need a range of experiences to kind of marry the two, don't you? And that really only happens with other people. You can't think your way out of that. I guess I guess in terms of thinking about then kind of maybe people listening to this who are saying, might be thinking, well, nothing massively kind of major happened to me. So I can't explain it through that. What would you say kind of to that, Muireann?
Yeah, and we regularly meet people who, you know, coming in to work with us, and they say, like you say, I have no reason to be depressed or struggling all the time. You know, I wasn't abused, nothing too awful really happened to me, and my physical needs are met, and I should be fine. It must be me. I'm just weak, or I'm just the problem. And it's really hard to hear that, because you know the person is adding to their emotional pain and struggle by sort of attacking and blaming themselves for it. And a lot of times they're not sufficiently rating the impact of maybe their emotional needs as children not being met. And at first they mightn't even believe that children have emotional needs, or that being loved even matters at all as a child. And it can take a while for some people to even begin to consider that emotional needs of children are real needs, and that those needs not being met can really lead to pain and struggle. And when people start to recognize that, that can create a really helpful shift, and looking back at your younger self with more compassion and understanding. And I sometimes think about it as looking back at your younger self with sort of kind eyes, and starting to really get what happened to you and to me, and rate that. And often that's the start of a healing journey. And then, of course, there are people who feel that they just can't look back in that way, or do the reflection that Eimear was talking about, that it might feel dreadfully disloyal to a parent, particular a parent who's maybe older now, or maybe ill now, or frail now, or even deceased now, that it just doesn't feel okay to think about how their actions and inactions from years ago might have impacted us as children. Or it might feel very threatening to our current relationship with that person, or it just might not feel worth it to go back to some really painful memories. And a lot of people come in and say, oh, I just want to move on, you know. And many of us do work really hard to sort of put things away and not think about them. But I think if we even if we are sort of working to put things away, they don't always magically go away. And they don't often stay far from the surface. So they're often ready to be triggered in the present, in sort of in similar situations. And more fundamentally, as we've been saying, that what's happened to us comes to shape and influence how we perceive new situations, and how we tend to react to current situations.
Yeah. And I guess it's important, isn't it? As you say, it's not about blaming anyone, or in a therapy session, it's going to be about that. It's about making sense of what's happened, to develop that kind of narrative. Because I suppose I'm thinking about it from different angles, maybe as an adult looking back, but also as a parent potentially listening to this. Maybe there might be people on thinking, gosh, am I doing a good enough job, or have I been kind of, you know, distracted or disconnected, maybe annoyed or angry with the kids at times. And maybe kind of Eimear, coming back to you, I wonder what you might suggest there in terms of what we know about from the research around helpful ideas for anyone who's thinking, oh God, right now, what can be helpful?
Yeah, and I think the first thing to say is there's no such thing as a perfect parent. As a parent myself, I have and do have less than ideal, you know, parenting moments, but we all do, you know. And Donald Winnicott came up with the expression good enough, being a good enough parent, you know, and that actually, as in all relationships, there will be conflict, there will be ruptures, there will be times we have a misattunement, or a misunderstanding, or an argument. And I think what's really important, I suppose, is the idea that when a rupture happens, and this is true for all our relationships, not just with our children, that we do, as soon as possible, try and make a repair. So really acknowledge, you know, actually, I'm really sorry, I snapped at you there, or I got angry, you know, I was tired, I was stressed, you know, I've had a hard day, you know, I really, you know, I really shouldn't have done that. And I'm really going to work harder to not do that. Or, you know, so that there's something about an honest and sincere and heartfelt apology as soon as you can, you know. And again, that, you know, we have to think about regulating ourselves first. It's like, if we're still really angry, are we actually able to say it? Or we, you know, the way sometimes as kids they say, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Try to really mean it, go, okay. Because in fact, most people have that positive intentionality. We come to our parenting wanting to do a good job. And I guess coming back to and it's inevitable. I mean, life is stressful, that there are times when it won't go according to plan. And then I suppose having that capacity again to think about self-reflection. Okay, what could I have done differently? And I suppose there's a parenting program called the Circle of Security, which is based on, I suppose, the attachment pieces we've been talking about, but they talk about the need for us as adults to be bigger, wiser, stronger, and kind, and you know, there are times when we're not. So when we're not being taking responsibility, and again, addressing those ruptures. And also there's the idea of, connecting before you correct. So when, small kids have tantrums or anger outbursts or whatever, it's a sign that they're overwhelmed, actually, that it's not that they're deliberately doing it to wind us up or to get at us, but actually maybe they're really tired, or they're hungry, or they're feeling hurt. And our job in that situation is to really just yeah, I see you. Maybe, a hug, a touch, just coming down to their level. And then later on, when they're emotionally regulated, to talk about how we could handle the situation differently. But no more than us, if we're flaming mad and someone is saying, I think you should have done that differently. We don't want to know it. We have to wait until our emotions have gone down, our nervous system is reset, and then we can hear it and think, well, actually, yeah, maybe I could have done something differently there. And I think, that so that the teachable moments, as Daniel Siegel would say, happen after, that you connect first. And he talks about something which I really like the idea of. It's that feeling felt, which is that our kids get that we understand how they're feeling and that we're really empathizing with them. And then we're helping them to think about how they could have managed the situation differently once they've calmed down, but not immediately. Because of course, there's times when you want to go, you shouldn't have did that. Why did you hit your brother? Why did you? And of course, they don't know. And in that moment, you're thinking about, well, what could you do in that situation? Again, is what we say later, when they've had a chance to regulate. And so I think that's probably really important. That there would be the things that would come to me in terms of that. And I suppose there's one other thing that applies to all our relationships, again, which can be helpful, is that mind reading. Like Muireann and Susan, you've been saying that because of our own early experiences, we bring that lens or that filter to our relationships, and we are like, oh, he must be angry with me because I did that. But actually, as adults, we can check it out. We can say, I just want to check, are we okay? Or are you annoyed at me? And then, and if they are, then you find out what it is. And quite often you find, no, sorry, I was distracted. There's a problem at work, or I'm worried about something else. So I was a bit short. But if it's our tendency to go, like Muireann said, I'm wrong, it's something I've done, that, we can spend hours, ruminating and, well, I should have done that, whatever. But actually, maybe the other person says, actually, sorry, no, I was just distracted, or, I'm worried about something else. So we can always ask the other person, are you okay? Are we okay? Something going on here? Have I done something? And at least then we can address it if we have. And if we haven't, we're giving ourselves that peace of mind and not second guessing ourselves.
Yeah, it's really important, isn't it, that mind reading piece? And I guess if your experience are that's been, it must be something I've done and tried to fix it then internally. As you say, as adults, we can check it out. And maybe in Ireland, we're getting better at having those conversations, of sort of what's gone on. I think you might be quite, I wonder, are you annoyed at me, or actually, yeah, I am annoyed at you because you really annoyed me when this happened. And then there can be a conversation about it, can't there? And that repair, maybe, as you mentioned. And I guess that's the key thing, that, as both of you are saying, kind of ruptures do happen. There's no such thing as perfect parenting. It's about the repair. And I suppose the other idea that's really nice is that kind of connecting, as you said, before you correct. And maybe that's also true for adults as well. It's before you get into the self-flagellation or the correction. It's like, well, maybe you're really tired, or maybe you're quite frightened in this scenario, before you get into, well, how could I do it differently?
Yeah. And so I was just going to say as well, maybe there's something as well, as often we are co-parenting. So
yeah.
our own, like they talk in the circle of security about our shark music, our own things that trigger us can be different than our partners. So we might be thinking, what the hell are they, losing around that for, when it's not we don't hear shark music. So trying to have those open conversations so that as much as possible that there's a consistent approach between two parents, that or that we help each other out, that we kind of go, okay, maybe I'll take it, and having those ways of, I suppose, reflecting together on, okay, what could we have done better? Did we pack too much in the day? Did we get the nap time wrong? Did we, not think about, just so I guess that's important too, because if, sometimes there can be different ways of managing situations, and then kids can be confusing because it's like, oh, but mom said that and you're saying that, and how do they make sense of it? And again, that will happen, right? So it's accepting it and then going, okay, you know what, we've been talking about it together, when we said that, what and just revisiting it and coming back and saying, we've had a chat about it and we think this is what is actually the right thing here, so we've decided. So I think that bit of having that consistency is so important, but also tricky, because lives are busy. Maybe you didn't get a chance to have a chat about it. So maybe say, like saying, oh, we'll talk to your dad or your mom together and we'll come back when we've had a chance, so giving yourself space when you're not sure, because sometimes we don't know in that moment what the right course of action is, and we need some time to think it through.
Yeah, it's really important, isn't it? I'm just thinking, seeing a couple of questions are coming through, so we might take a few questions now. This one maybe we've kind of hovered over, but what would be the best route for an individual to change the patterns that take them back to childlike feeling? So even when they're adults, so within those kind of close relationships. I don't know, Muireann or Eimear, which one of you might want to take that? The best route to change the patterns. I mean, I would think maybe it's sort of touching on what we had sort of started talking about in terms of building that self-awareness. I guess it could be a therapy, couldn't it? I don't know that it's not necessarily therapy is going to be right for everyone at every time, but I suppose it's building that kind of knowledge of what happens in you and your own sort of story, isn't it?
I think even I think we're going to put in the notes after the session. There's some sort of some suggested reading that they leave, and that was they call it bibliotherapy, but sort of reading that sort of maybe is like pre-therapy work, where you can, and for a lot of people that, the right kind of reading can be really helpful to sort of start to join the dots, and maybe some journaling in relation to that. And then if somebody, if people feel like, oh, I'm beginning to get this more, and I'm a bit afraid of reflecting back, but actually I really feel the motivation to do that if I have the right supports. And then it's about finding those right supports. And sometimes it's in your normal network of, that you have a sister or a good friend you go walking with, or someone who, you can talk through some of this with. Or sometimes it is more of a professional that, counselor, therapist, psychologist, that you feel like you want to go and try and do a piece of work, and that because of doing some preliminary reading, you're kind of more ready, or you kind of know what you want to focus on in those sessions.
So we give a better sense maybe of some of the thinking in this area, and kind of attachment thinking more generally maybe. And
that book, The What Happened to You, is really lovely. And actually I got it on the Public Library Borrow Box app as an audiobook. And it's really nice because Bruce Perry reads it and then Oprah reads it, and they just have a lovely flow back and forth between them. And so that's a really nice one. And there's another one that's more psychology based, but it's called The General Theory of Love. It's by a man called Thomas Lewis. And it just summarized a lot of the attachment science that you referenced, Susan, but also sort of the upgrades of that over the preceding 100 years, or the following 80 years or so. So yeah, that's a nice one.
Yeah, because I guess because I suppose in our webinar today, we've been talking, I suppose, about attachment sort of generally. There's different ways to look at it, isn't there? There's a question kind of coming in there about attachment styles as adults, and kind of the focus on parenting. But I guess for many of us, we were parented, and I suppose maybe what we're talking about today is that sense of how our early experiences kind of translate into our adult relationships. Would you say, is that kind of a fair sort of description of And maybe thinking there's different labels and names for that, but kind of this is a bit of a baseline of kind of how that might work, and people might kind of then explore that in their own way, in different, whether, as you say, we're in kind of maybe reading, or whether that's maybe different kinds of therapy as well, of saying, well, this is how I react in close relationships. This is kind of
so it's not just how we react to our children, but it's also maybe how we react to our love partners, or to our friends, to our close friends, or to our grown-up family that we're, you know, our family of origin, who are all now adults. Or as you have maybe caring responsibilities for parents, what's getting stirred up as you're caring for your parents.
Sure, yeah. So I guess it's probably our kind of more intimate relationships where this shows up most heavily, not necessarily to children, but as you say, to kind of partners or friends, that kind of piece. Yeah.
I think maybe, sorry,
Go
Susan,
ahead.
just even that bringing a curiosity to it.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
when we have a big reaction, you think, oh, I've really felt that intensely, you know, maybe giving ourselves a bit of space, like Muireann said, sure, let's even think about that and go, okay, what was it about that situation? What does it remind me of? What might have been going on for me in that? And even trying to bring that bit of curiosity and compassion. It's like, you know, we're humans and we get things wrong, we make mistakes, but we can also learn from it. So maybe even that, noticing the kind of situations where we feel, you know, knocked out of kilter, or, you know, that we're kind of go, really, why is that annoying me so much? Or why am I feeling such a strong feeling about that? Can be useful just as a starting point before maybe, and then as Warren said, the reading. And then if you do feel, actually, I need more individual, maybe one-to-one work with a therapist, if that feels appropriate. But, you know, there's a lot of material out there that can really help now, that's evidence-based, and that, like, we put that reading list together, some starting points. Yeah.
It's really key, isn't it? Because I guess there's a lot of stuff out there on attachment styles, isn't there? But and you know, so and there's a question kind of coming in here about, well, how do you know which one you are? Which I think is a question a lot of people might have, and I suppose and that label can be really useful. I guess it can kind of clarify behaviors of your own and maybe other people. But I suppose it's also, I really like that idea, Eimear, of that curiosity of what's actually happening. So when I feel someone maybe being distant or angry, what's my reaction to that? That's really the starting point, beyond the kind of, this must mean I'm X or Y. So, well, actually for me, what does that mean? Where do I go to in my mind? Where do I go to with them? And starting that process of unpacking it, would you say, is that kind of
both Eimear and I work a lot with schema therapy, and so that's very focused on the idea of that there's these filters that get embedded in when we're young about ourselves and other people. And we start, you know, so very often within that model, you're offering people the chance to take a questionnaire to start really recognizing what their filters are. So for some people, it's oh, I never get the love that I want, or for other people, it's oh, other people always try to hurt me or harm me, or for other people, it's the world is a really scary place, and I'm really small and vulnerable. So there's different filters, and so again, those kinds of questionnaires, and there's Reinventing Your Life is the book that Jeffrey Young has had written for sort of for everybody and anybody, and that's another nice jumping off point to start to recognize maybe what your filters are, the lenses that you're bringing to every situation.
And that's a way of thinking in schema therapy, as you said. So Jeffrey Young's book. There's a couple of questions coming in about where's the reading list. So we will circulate that in the automatic email that comes after this this webinar. So, and I guess maybe I'm just thinking about that. It's so interesting, isn't it? So each of us, all three of us, have our own lens. And we may not be aware, as you said, Muireann, of the lens of friends or partners, or we maybe get to learn that over time with people, but it can be very different. So again, it comes back to that mind reading, doesn't it, of attributing an intention or an emotion to someone who might be seeing things a completely different way. And I guess that makes me think of that kind of anxious, avoidant sort of interaction at times that can feel very, very challenging for people. And maybe kind of related to that a little bit, as someone's asking about where is it here? The kind of ideas around group work. So kind of, I don't know if you've got any views on kind of group work in addition or instead of individual therapy, how that might work out for people.
Oh, I think I'm probably a recent convert to group work. We have done some group work in the last few years, and just been really blown away by what we could achieve in a group. That just, you know, when things land for people at a much deeper level. So, you know, I might be as a therapist plugging away at, you are good enough, you know, you are worthwhile and you have value, and people are kind of in their minds, they're sort of half going, well, you would say that, you're a psychologist, you know. But when someone in the group really responds to someone and says, no, I really see you, I really think you're, you know, I see you're having a hard time when you're really worth something, and say something really warm and compassionate, it just lands for people. That, you know, someone who doesn't necessarily have skin in the game just wants to say that to them, that it can be a real restorative refamilying experience. That the facilitator's job is to set up sort of a healthy family environment, and then allow the group to do its own, you know, to meet each other and respond to each other. And I think it can be real, just give people a lot more, restore their faith in other people.
I guess it comes back to that idea again of the healing being in other relationships, not just your lone work or kind of figuring things out. It's about the different felt experience, isn't it? As you say that, psychologists will, it's like, of course we'd say that, you know, we're there to kind of hear and validate people, but in that those other relationships that people can be seen. It looks like you want to jump in there, Eimear.
I'm just saying, even being part of a community can be very healing, you know. So if I'm into open water swim, but even that sense of creating a community where you're meeting different people who have different life experiences that you may not necessarily meet, you know. So having maybe a shared interest around and getting involved in a community group, or, you know, volunteering or something, can give you a different experience too, like change some of those filters, and you go, actually people are kind or caring or considerate or thoughtful. Not everyone is, you know. If you've got that negative, you know, schemas of like people are untrustworthy, or I think it's Tara Brach talks about look for the helpers, that you know, even when you see major disasters, there's also good in the world, and sometimes it can be hard to see that when we've had very negative, you know, experiences of being hurt by others. So I think, you know, any sort of a sense of community or group where you're meeting other people can, I suppose, update and revise our schemas or our ways of looking at the world, you know, in a way that can be really healing.
Yeah, it's really important, isn't it? Those different experiences, you say, kind of update those filters, and which I guess there is hope in that, isn't there? There's hope of different relationships, of meaningful connections and loving connections that maybe have a different experience. And makes me think back to what you were saying there earlier, or maybe as you, Eimear, that kind of turning off the more difficult emotions also could turn off the more positive, the more kind of enjoyable ones, and they're our bridge to connect with people, aren't they? So it's important to kind of make room for all of it. I'm just aware we're kind of coming to the end of time, so thank you all so much for the questions that you've put in, and apologies if we didn't get to your one. Hopefully the resources that we'll share after our webinar today might go some way to answering some of the kind of outstanding queries. I think maybe as we come to a close, though, maybe I'll start with you, Muireann, and then Eimear, just kind of very briefly, kind of what you feel is the most important idea maybe that you would want people to take away with them from our conversation today.
Maybe it's looking back to younger you with curiosity and kindness.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And Eimear, what about yourself?
Yeah, I guess it's similarly that childhood experience isn't destiny, and that we can change, and the concept of earned security, actually, that, or learned security, which I think I prefer. It's like we can change our filters and, you know, have more meaningful and supportive relationships at any stage in our lives. You know, once we're willing to do that, I suppose, the difficult work sometimes of reflecting and reaching out to others, that it is change is possible.
Absolutely. Oh, well, listen, thank you both so much. It's been a really, really interesting discussion. I hope those kind of watching have found it helpful. Thank you, Muireann, for your experience and expertise, and you too, Eimear. It's been, as I said, really, really useful, as really a nice starting point to start thinking, okay, well, so what maybe in terms of like changes for people and that being possible. And as I said, we'll circulate
thanks, Susan,
that
for the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
And
you're
to
very
our-
welcome. It's a really, really good conversation. And as we said, yeah, for people who are interested in finding out more, we'll circulate those resources. So thank you both very much. Moving on then to our webinar for next month. So talking about suicide is the title. We'll be meeting again on the 11th of September at the usual time of 12 o'clock. And delighted to be joined by Barbara Brennan there. So hopefully many of you can make it. Thank you both very much again. Thanks everyone for watching, and hopefully see many of you next week.
Thanks.
Thank you.